The lawyer in the very good suit stood up in front of the judge, gestured at me with an easy, pitying smile, and said, "Your Honor, with respect, my client is dealing with a confused elderly woman who doesn't really understand her own paperwork." And I let him finish. I want you to notice that. I sat there in my plain gray cardigan with my reading glasses on a chain and my hands folded on top of a single manila folder. And I let him say every word of it, because 63 years of life, and 30 of them spent in rooms exactly like this one, had taught me something that man had never learned. The very best time to open the folder is right after they've told everyone it's empty. My name is Harriet Dunn. Everyone calls me Hattie. And this is the story of the afternoon a smooth-talking developer who had spent years robbing widows made the single worst business decision of his life. He picked the wrong widow. I have to tell you about Walt first, because Walt is the reason any of this happened, and Walt is the reason it ended the way it did. Walt was my husband for 39 years. He was a big, gentle, quiet man who worked with his hands. And the great love of his life, after me, he always said, and always winked when he said it, was his workshop. It was a solid little building at the back of our lot that he built himself, board by board, over the course of decades. He made furniture in there, cradles for every baby born on our street, a rocking chair I still sit in every evening. That workshop was Walt's heart with a roof on it. I spent 39 years listening to the sounds of that building, the whine of the lathe, the patient rhythm of hand sanding, which Walt insisted on for anything that mattered. The machine does the work, Hattie, but the hand does the caring, he used to say. On summer evenings, I'd bring 2 cups of tea out and sit on the old stool in the corner and just watch him make something out of a rough plank. And neither of us would say much. And it was the most married I ever felt, in that quiet, in the smell of sawdust and linseed oil. He made our granddaughter's crib in there. He made the dining table we ate every dinner of our marriage at. When a young couple moved onto the street, Walt would show up a few weeks later with a cutting board or a little bookshelf. No occasion, just because he'd noticed they were starting out. He never charged anyone a cent. "You don't sell the caring," he'd say. "You give it away. Or it's not caring, it's just carpentry." So when I tell you that Roland Keener set out to take that building from me, I need you to understand it wasn't a shed and a lawsuit. It was the last room on earth that still held the shape of my husband's hands. Every joint in it was a decision Walt had made. Tearing it out from under me wasn't a property dispute. It was a second attempt at widowing me by a man who'd never met Walt and wouldn't have understood him if he had. Because Roland Keir was a man who sold the caring, and Walt was a man who gave it away. And those 2 kinds of men do not fit inside the same understanding of what a life is for. Walt died on a Tuesday in March of the fast kind of illness that doesn't give you time to get used to the idea. And for a while after that, I was not a person so much as a shape that moved through a house. doing the next thing, and the next thing, the way the newly widowed do. Which is exactly the kind of woman that a man like Roland Keir goes looking for. Roland Keir was a property developer. He had a nice car and nicer teeth, and the particular warmth of a man who has learned that warmth is the most efficient tool for taking things from people. He came to my door about 4 months after Walt died, having done his homework. He knew I was alone. He knew I was grieving. He knew the property was paid off and worth a great deal more than the neighborhood used to be. He had a proposition. He'd noticed Walt's workshop. Such a shame, he said, for it to sit unused. He could renovate it, bring it up to code, turn it into a little rental studio. A source of income for a widow living on a fixed pension. He'd handle the permits, the crew, everything. I wouldn't have to lift a finger. He'd take care of me. I want to be honest with you about something, because I think it matters. I said yes when I should have said no. I was lonely and I was sad. And here was a kind-seeming man offering to make Walt's workshop into something that would live on. Grief makes you reach for anything that sounds like a future. I signed his contract. I trusted him. That was my one mistake, and I've forgiven myself for it. And I'd ask you to forgive yourself for the equivalent one in your own life, because we've all signed something while we were bleeding. But here is the thing about me that Roland Keir did not bother to find out. Because to him, I was just a sad old woman with a paid-off lot. For 30 years, before I retired, I was a legal secretary. Let me tell you what a legal secretary actually is. Because people hear the word secretary and they picture someone answering phones. A good legal secretary is the person who builds the case. The lawyers stand up in court and give the speeches and take the credit. But somewhere behind them is a woman who assembled every exhibit, organized every document, caught the error in the contract, remembered the deadline that would have sunk them, and kept the files so clean and so complete that when the moment came, everything was exactly where it needed to be. I did that for 3 decades, for some of the best litigators in the county. I was invisible and I was essential, and those two things went together. The way they so often do for women of my generation. And here is what 30 years of that does to a person. It makes documentation a reflex. It makes keeping records not a chore, but an instinct, like breathing. I have kept a copy of everything of consequence that has crossed my hands since 1987. I photograph. I date, I file. I don't throw things away. So when Roland Keir's renovation of Walt's workshop began, and something in the back of my neck, the old instinct, the case builder's instinct, began to whisper that things weren't right, I did the only thing I know how to do. I opened a folder and I started filling it. It went bad slowly, and then all at once, the way these things do. The crew that showed up didn't look right to me. So I photographed them, and their truck, and their plates, dated. The work was shoddy. I could see that Walt's careful old bones were being covered over with cheap, fast garbage. So I photographed the work, every stage, Dated. Kier's invoices started climbing, far past what we'd agreed, full of vague line items. So I kept every invoice and every email, and I wrote down every phone call. The date, the time, what was said. And when I called Kier to ask politely why the cost had tripled and why the permit he'd promised to file wasn't posted anywhere on the site, he got, for just a moment, less warm. And in that moment, on that call, he said some things a careful man wouldn't have said. I live in a state where it is perfectly legal to record a phone call you yourself are part of. One-party consent, the law calls it. I know that because I spent 30 years around lawyers who lived and died by that kind of detail. And I had, without any drama, simply started recording my calls with Roland Kier the moment my neck first prickled. There was one afternoon that told me everything, though I stayed polite through all of it. I'd walked out to the workshop while the crew was there, and I'd found one of them, a young man, not a bad kid, just working for a bad man, about to cover a section of Waltz, original hand-cut framing with cheap particle board, straight over the top, hiding good bones under garbage to save an hour. I asked him, gently, if the old framing shouldn't be preserved. And he looked at me, embarrassed. And he said, "Ma'am, I just do what Mr. Kier tells me. He says with the older clients, we just, cover it and move on. They don't check. They don't check." He said it and then went red because he heard it as it came out of him. The older clients. They don't check. That was the business model, spoken aloud by a kid who didn't yet know he was confessing to a crime. I thanked him. I did not make a scene. I went inside and I wrote down the date and the time and his exact words, and I added it to the folder. And I understood that I was not a customer in a dispute. I was a mark in a scheme, and the scheme had a shape, and shapes can be proven. So I had him, on tape, in his own voice. But I didn't know yet how much I'd need it. Because Roland Keener, when I finally refused to pay the inflated final bill, did the thing he'd apparently done to a number of old people before me. He didn't just walk away. He filed a claim that I owed him tens of thousands of dollars, put a lien on my property, and moved to force a sale. To take my home and Walt's workshop over a debt he had invented. He was suing me, and he was betting, as he'd bet successfully many times, that a 63-year-old widow would be too frightened, too tired, and too alone to fight. The day the papers arrived, I sat down at the kitchen table and I shook. I want to be honest about that, because I think people imagine that someone who knows the law isn't frightened by it, and that's exactly backwards. I knew, better than most, how much a lawsuit can cost, how a determined man with resources can grind an ordinary person down, how the process itself is the punishment, even when you're right. I looked at that stack of legal papers with Roland Kier's lawyer's name on, the letterhead, and I felt the whole weight of it. The money, the years, the possibility that I could do everything correctly and still lose my home because I couldn't outspend him. For about an hour, I believed I would lose. I sat in Walt's rocking chair, and I nearly picked up the phone to offer Keir half of what he demanded, just to make the fear stop. And then I got up, and I made a cup of tea, because that's what you do. And while the kettle boiled, I looked out the window at the workshop, and I thought about Walt's hands. And I thought about the young man on the crew, saying they don't check. And I felt the fear turn, slowly, into something much more useful. Because here is a thing I know that Roland Keener did not. Fear and preparation are the same energy, pointed in opposite directions. He was counting on my fear. He had no idea I knew how to turn it around and aim it at a folder. Everyone told me to settle. My sister told me to settle. A neighbor told me to settle. Even the one lawyer I could briefly afford to consult, a nice young man who clearly saw me as fragile, gently advised me that fighting a developer with resources was a losing battle for someone in my situation, and that I should try to negotiate a smaller payment and keep the house. "You don't want the stress, Mrs. Dunn," he said kindly. "At your age." At my age. There it was again, the two words that had been following me around since Walt died. At my age. As if 63 were a diagnosis. As if I had stopped being a person with a mind and become a problem to be managed gently toward the exit. I want to sit with that for a moment, because I think it's the quiet heart of this whole story. And I think a lot of you know exactly the feeling I mean. There's a thing that happens to a woman as she gets older, and it happens faster if she's also widowed, also plain, also alone. You become invisible in a specific way. Not ignored exactly, but discounted. People start finishing your sentences. They start speaking a little louder and a little slower, as if age were a foreign country you'd emigrated to. They stop asking what you think and start telling you what would be best for you. And the terrible thing is how reasonable it all sounds, how kind it's dressed up to be. Nobody says, "We've decided you don't matter." They say, "You don't want the stress. At your age." They manage you. And if you're tired enough and sad enough, you can start to manage yourself. The same way. Start believing that the safest thing, the dignified thing, is to go quietly. I had spent 4 months going quietly, grieving Walt, shrinking, letting the world treat me as a problem to be solved. And I might have kept going quietly, all the way to the loss of the one building on Earth that still held his hands. If a man in a good suit hadn't been so very certain that quiet was all I had left in me, he mistook my grief for my whole personality. It was the last mistake he made before I stopped being quiet. I went home. I sat in Walt's rocking chair, and I looked at my folder, my thick, dated, meticulous folder, and I felt the old instinct sit up straight inside me. I decided I would represent myself. In civil court, you're allowed to. And I thought, I have spent 30 years preparing cases for men who then stood up and won them. Just once, before I'm done, I am going to prepare the case and stand up and win it myself. I spent 3 weeks preparing the way I used to prepare for the lawyers I'd worked for, the good ones. The ones who won because the work behind them was flawless. I sat at Walt's desk every night, and I built my case the way Walt built furniture. One careful joint at a time, sanding every edge, nothing hidden, nothing hurried. I organized every document into a numbered index. I pulled the certified county records. I got the printout from the state licensing board. I wrote out, in my own hand, a transcript of the recording, time-stamped to the second. I anticipated every argument Keir's lawyer might make, and I built a document to answer each one. And I tabbed them, and I lettered them, and I practiced. Out loud, alone, in my kitchen, at 63 years old, in my late husband's cardigan. The calm, unhurried voice I'd heard 100 good attorneys use. The voice that doesn't argue with you, just shows you the truth and waits. The night before the hearing, I couldn't sleep. So I went out to the workshop, what was left of it. Keir's cheap work still scarring Walt's good bones, and I sat on the old stool in the corner, in the dark, in the smell of sawdust that somehow still lived in the walls. And I talked to Walt a little. I told him I was scared. I told him I was going to try to save it. And I swear to you, in the quiet, I could almost hear him say what he always said. The machine does the work, Hattie. But the hand does the caring. I'd cared for 30 years, invisibly, on other people's cases. In the morning, for the first time, I was going to care out loud on my own. The hearing was on a Thursday afternoon, in a plain county courtroom with bad lighting and a flag in the corner. Roland Keir sat at his table, in a suit that cost more than my monthly pension, next to his attorney, a polished man named Mr. Sloan, who had the specific confidence of someone who has never once expected to lose to a person like me. They had a stack of glossy documents. They had a strategy. And their strategy, I understood the moment Sloan opened his mouth, was very simple: to make the court see what everyone else had seen since Walt died. A confused, fragile old woman, in over her head. Mr. Sloan laid it on thick. He spoke slowly to me, as if English were my second language, and my first language were also difficult for me. He referred to me repeatedly as the elderly homeowner and Mrs. Dunn, who I'm sure is doing her best. And then he turned to Judge and delivered the line I began this story with. Your Honor, with respect, my client is dealing with a confused elderly woman who doesn't really understand her own paperwork. She signed a contract. She failed to pay. It's unfortunate that it's come to this. But sympathy isn't a defense against a valid debt. And I let him finish. I folded my hands on my folder, and I let Mr. Sloan say every single word. And I watched the judge, a woman about my age, sharp-eyed behind her glasses, listen with a carefully neutral face. And when Sloan sat down, pleased, and the judge said, Mrs. Dunn, would you like to respond? I said, Thank you, Your Honor. I would. May I approach and submit some exhibits? I saw Sloan's easy smile flicker, just slightly, at the word exhibits. I opened the folder. I did it the way I'd done it 1,000 times for other people. Except this time, it was mine. Your Honor, I said, I'd like to begin with the contract Mr. Keener's attorney referenced, because I understand it perfectly well. Exhibit A. You'll note the agreed price here on page 2, initialed by both parties. Now, Exhibit B is the final invoice Mr. Keir submitted, for 3 times that amount. I've highlighted the difference. I do understand subtraction, despite my age. A small sound from the gallery. The judge's mouth did not smile, but her eyes did. Exhibit C, I said, sliding the next set across, is a series of 41 photographs, each date-stamped, documenting the actual work performed on my late husband's workshop. You'll see the code violations circled. I've cross-referenced each one to the building code section it violates in the index on the last page. Sloane started to rise. Your Honor, Exhibit D, I continued, calmly, because I had waited 30 years. This, and I was not going to be hurried, is the building permit Mr. Keir contractually agreed to file and repeatedly told me he had filed. This is a certified copy of the county permit record for my address, obtained last month. You'll notice there is no such permit. Then you'll notice Exhibit E, the permit document Mr. Keir emailed to me, claiming it was filed. Compare the two, Your Honor. The one he sent me was never in the county system. It appears to have been fabricated. The courtroom had gone very quiet. Roland Keir's nice teeth had disappeared behind a closed mouth. Exhibit F, I said, is a printout from the state licensing board, dated, showing that the contracting crew Mr. Keener employed on my property held no valid license during the period of the work. I've circled the relevant dates. Sloane was fully standing now. Your Honor, she's clearly had help. This is beyond. I had 30 years of help, Mr. Sloane, I said, and I turned and looked at him for the first time. I was a legal secretary in this very courthouse before you passed the bar. I built cases like this one for a living. I simply built this one for myself. I turned back to the judge. And before my last exhibit, Your Honor, I'd direct the court to Exhibit F2, a signed, dated statement I obtained from one of Mr. Keir's own crew members, a young man who was uncomfortable with what he'd been asked to do. He describes being instructed to conceal original structural work behind cheap material, specifically because, and I'm quoting his statement, with the older clients, they don't check. The word older sat in that courtroom like a stone dropped in still water. I watched the judge's pen pause over her notepad. I watched Mr. Sloane very carefully not look at his client. So this is not, Your Honor, a misunderstanding between a contractor and a confused old woman, I said, still calm, still unhurried, the way the good ones taught me. This is a documented method, and I've saved Exhibit G for last, because it's the one that speaks in Mr. Keir's own voice. Exhibit G, I said, is an audio recording. I live in a one-party consent state, and I was a party to this call, so it is lawfully obtained and admissible. It's a phone conversation between Mr. Keir and myself, dated the 14th of that month, I've provided a certified transcript, but I'd ask the court to hear the relevant 30 seconds. The judge nodded. The clerk played it. And Roland Keir's own warm, easy voice filled that courtroom, saying to a grieving widow he thought would never fight back the words that ended him, explaining, with a chuckle, that the price had gone up because that's how it works with you folks. And that if I didn't pay, there are ways to make this very hard on an old lady living alone. And most of them just pay to make it stop. His voice, his words, his scheme, described in his own mouth, played back in a room full of people while he sat there and listened to himself. When it stopped, the silence was total. I closed my folder. I folded my hands back on top of it. And I said, "I'm sorry to have taken so much of the court's time, Your Honor. I know I'm just a confused old woman who doesn't understand her paperwork. I have never, before or since, seen a lawyer sit down as slowly as Mr. Sloane sat down. He tried once to recover, because that's what they're trained to do. He got halfway to his feet and said, 'Your Honor, the recording's authenticity would need to be—' And the judge, without even looking up from the document I'd handed her, said, 'Mr. Sloane, she's provided the chain of custody, the date metadata, and a certified transcript. It's more thoroughly documented than most exhibits I see from firms with their own litigation departments. Sit down.' And he sat. And I want to tell you, there is a specific silence that falls over a courtroom when everyone in it realizes at the same moment that the person they'd all quietly agreed was helpless is, in fact, the most prepared person in the room. It is one of the sweetest silences I know. I'd spent 30 years arranging that silence for other people, standing at the back, invisible. Making it happen for myself at 63 in my late husband's cardigan, I won't pretend it wasn't the proudest moment of my professional life. It was. Roland Keir, for his part, had stopped looking at me entirely. He was looking at his lawyer, and his lawyer was looking at the table. And I understood the whole language of it, because I'd sat in that room 1,000 times. It was the body language of a case that everyone at the defense table now knew was over. They just had to wait for someone official to say so. The developer who'd been so warm on my doorstep, so certain a grieving widow, was easy money. Could not, in the end, meet the eyes of the grief. That's the thing about people who prey on the people they think can't fight back. They are never as brave when the person fights back. Cruelty is almost always cowardice that found an easy target. Take away the easy, and the cowardice is all that's left. The judge ruled for me. Of course she did. She dismissed Keener's claim entirely, voided the lien, and ordered him to refund what I'd overpaid, plus my costs. But she did something else, too. And it's the part I think about most. Before she gavelled it closed, she looked at Roland Keener over her glasses, and she said, in a flat, careful voice, "Mr. Keir, this court has now seen evidence of a forged permit, an unlicensed crew, and recorded statements suggesting a deliberate pattern of targeting elderly homeowners. that goes well beyond this civil matter. I would strongly encourage you to speak with your attorney about which other authorities are likely to find this afternoon's exhibits interesting, because I intend to make sure they receive them. And then, as the room was gathering itself, she looked at me, really looked, and a private smile crossed her face, and she said, "It's good to see you again, Hattie. You always did keep the cleanest files in the building." She'd been a young attorney 30 years ago in the firm where I worked. I'd built cases she'd won when she was younger than Sloan. She'd never forgotten the invisible woman who kept the folders clean. Nobody ever really forgets that woman. They just don't tell her, usually, until it matters. Roland Keir's afternoon in that courtroom was the beginning of the end of Roland Keir. The judge was as good as her word. The evidence in my folder, the forged permit, the unlicensed crew, the recording, went where it needed to go. And it turned out I was far from the only widow Keir had done this to. There had been others, older, more frightened, more alone. Women who had folded, exactly as he'd bet they would, and paid to make it stop, and never known they weren't the only one. Once the pattern had a folder behind it, they came forward, one after another. Roland Keir is not developing anything anymore, except possibly a new appreciation for the criminal code. I saw him one more time, months later, in a hallway of that same courthouse, on his way to a matter that had nothing gentle about it. He looked smaller. The good suit was the same, but the man inside it had shrunk. The way men like that do, once the charm stops working and there's nothing underneath it holding them up. He saw me, and for just a second, I saw him decide whether to sneer or to plead, and land, finally, on neither, because there was nothing left to perform for. He just looked at me. This man who had tried to take my husband's workshop by betting I was too old and too sad and too alone to fight. And I looked back at him, and I did not gloat. I want you to know that. I had earned the right to, and I didn't take it. I just looked at him long enough for both of us to know exactly what had happened. And then I walked on, because I had somewhere to be, and he no longer mattered to me at all. That, I've decided, is what winning actually looks like. Not a speech, not a scene. Just the moment the person who tried to break you stops being able to occupy any room in your head. I found 2 of those other women afterward, quietly, and I sat at their kitchen tables the way somebody should have sat at mine, and I helped them build their own folders. Because I've come to believe that the loneliest part of being preyed on isn't the money. It's the being made to feel that you're the only one and that you're too small and too old and too confused to fight. You are not the only one, and you are not to anything. One of them was named Dorothy. She was 78, and Keir had taken nearly her entire savings on a roof repair that was neither. And she had paid him to make the threats stop. And she had been so ashamed. That's the word she kept using. Ashamed. that she'd never told her own children. She thought it meant she was going senile. She thought it was her fault for trusting him. I sat with Dorothy for a whole afternoon, and I told her what I'm telling you, that being trusting is not the same as being stupid, that being targeted is not the same as being weak, and that the shame she was carrying belonged to Roland Keir and had somehow, in the dark, ended up in her chest instead of his, and we were going to put it back where it belonged. We built her folder together. Her hands shook the way mine had, and when she signed her statement, she sat up a little straighter, and she said, "I'm not confused. I remember every bit of it." And I said, "I know you do, Dorothy. That's exactly why he's going to lose." The other woman was named Frances, and her story was its own heartbreak, and her folder was its own quiet weapon. And the three of us, Dorothy, Frances, and I, became something keener, had never counted on when he picked women he thought were alone. We were not alone anymore. We had each other, and we had our folders, and it turned out that was more than enough. My sister called me after it was all over. She was the one who'd told me at the start to just settle, to not put myself through it at my age. And she said, a little sheepishly, "I have to admit, Hattie, I didn't think you could do it. I thought you'd lose the house. I was trying to protect you." And I told her the truth, which is, the thing I most want you to take from all of this. I said, "I know you were. Everyone was trying to protect me. That's exactly how they almost got the house." Every single person in my life looked at a 63-year-old widow and saw someone to be protected instead of someone to be believed. And there's a hair's breadth of difference between protecting someone and underestimating them. And that hair's breadth is where people like Roland Keir make their whole living. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "I'll believe you next time." And I said, "Good, because there's going to be a next time. There's always a next Keir. And now I know how to build a folder, I don't intend to stop." Because here's what I found. Once the fear was gone, I liked it. 63 years old, and I discovered in the worst season of my life that the thing I was best at, the invisible, patient, document by document work I'd done for other people for 30 years, was a thing I could do for myself and for other frightened people, and that it mattered. Walt used to say, a good tool doesn't stop being a good tool just because it's old. He was talking about a hand plane. I've decided he was also talking about me. I kept Walt's workshop. I had a real crew, a licensed one this time, an honest young woman who runs her own outfit. Undo Keogh's cheap garbage and restore it the way Walt built it. It's a proper little studio now, exactly what Keir once promised and never intended to deliver. I don't rent it out. I use it. I've started making furniture in there myself. Badly, slowly, learning from the notes Walt left in his careful hand. There's a half-finished cradle on the bench right now. My granddaughter's due in the spring. It'll be crooked, that cradle. I'm no Walt, and I never will be. But it'll be made by hand, with the caring in it, the way he'd have wanted And my granddaughter will sleep in something her grandfather's workshop made, even though her grandfather never got to meet her. Roland Keir very nearly took that from her, and from me. And he doesn't even know her name. That's the thing about the people who try to take what matters most. They so rarely understand what it is they're reaching for. To him, it was a lot on a paid-off property. To me, it was Walt's hands and a cradle and a girl not yet born who will grow up knowing that when someone tried to take her family's heart, her grandmother opened a folder and would not let them. Sometimes, in the evening, I sit in it, in the smell of sawdust that still somehow lives in the walls. And I talk to Walt a little, and I tell him, we kept it. We kept it, love. They tried to take it, and we kept it. The lawyer in the very good suit told an entire courtroom that I was a confused old woman who didn't understand her own paperwork. And he said it with a smile. And I let him finish every word. Here's what I most want you to take from that. Whoever you are, however old you are, whatever they've decided you're too small or too tired or too late to do, the people who underestimate you are handing you a gift, if you're patient enough to unwrap it at the right moment. They lower their guard. They tell the whole room the folder is empty. And they never once imagine that the quiet person they're patronizing has spent a lifetime invisibly learning to do the exact thing they're now certain she cannot do. So keep your receipts. Keep your records. Keep your folder, whatever your folder is. And when they tell everyone it's empty, that is precisely, exactly the moment you open it.